How's it going, everybody? Hey, Kelly.
Hey, good morning. Well, afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's okay. Since I haven't done this before, will you be reading questions? How is it going to go?
Yeah, so I collected some questions ahead of time
Okay.
in case there's a lull in questions here, and then I have them written down right here. And then people will be able to ask in the stream. I'll see the questions. I don't know if you can see.
Just a minute ago, I saw one coming through, but the light is a little bright for me, so it would be easier if you were to read them.
Yeah, that's no problem.
So I can see some of the comments.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
So I guess we can go ahead and do this. Could you take a second and introduce yourself? Tell everybody a little bit about who you are, and then we'll get started with some basic questions that parents have submitted. Partly as a response to our podcast interview, and as a response to the announcement that we were going to be doing this too. So
Sure. So hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Dr. Theoharis Theoharides. You can just call me Dr. Theo for short. I was born in Greece. I came to Yale University back in the 60s and spent about 18 years there. So my PhD and MD degree are from Yale. And I went to Tufts University in Boston, where I started the Department of Pharmacology, did internal medicine. I spent about 30 years studying what we call neuroinflammation, or how inflammation might affect the nervous system, especially the brain. And as a few years ago, I'm now down at Nova Southeastern University, where I created a center for the study of neuroinflammatory, especially complex diseases, obviously focusing on autism, among others.
very cool. So one of the things that I really found fascinating about our previous conversation was how you were able to sort of describe what my kids were experiencing without me telling you everything. Excuse me.
Thank you.
And that was a really big eye opener for me, because I love information and understanding what's going on so that I can better help and support, my kids.
Of course.
And it's been a long journey for us. We're 25 years in, and there are still mysteries that weren't explained until I was speaking with you. So can you start out by helping people understand the relationship between neuroinflammation and autism that you have?
For sure. So first of all, I don't believe that autism is a disease. I really think that something happens to the brain either during pregnancy or soon thereafter that resets the reactivity of the part of the brain that regulates behavior. We call it the amygdala, and the hippocampus that relates to memory. So the word inflammation is a very general term, and it's misused or abused all the time. So you have a little, a small thorn in your finger, you get past, that's inflammation. If you've got eczema, your skin, it's inflammation. If you've got asthma, you've got inflammation of the lungs. If you've got multiple sclerosis, it's inflammation of the brain. But the molecules and the mechanisms involved in each type of inflammation is very different. And it's very difficult to image inflammation, especially in the brain. So usual techniques such as CAT scan or MRI cannot really see inflammation. Maybe something called SPECT scan, or single positive emission computed tomography, might be able to see that, and I'll explain what that means. Mm-hmm. So almost 15 years ago, I was absolutely stunned when at a meeting of individuals that had different and difficult allergic-like symptoms, they had brought their families. Many of the families included children on the spectrum. And I had very little knowledge about the subject matter, I'm sorry to say, at the time. But it was very, very stunning to me that there would be so many children under the same roof that otherwise had allergic-like problems. So what is allergy? So the strictest, and I'll get to the inflammation, the strictest form of allergy is when you have elevated amounts of an immunoglobulin called immunoglobulin E, we call it IgE, and then you're exposed to an allergen. It may be a food allergen or a volatile allergen or antigen. And when the antigen or allergen binds to the immunoglobulin E that sits on the surface of the unique immune cells called the mast cells, it triggers a reaction, and the mast cell literally explodes and releases as many as 300 molecules, of which, unfortunately, we only know and deal with histamine primarily. That's why we have antihistamines. However, many of the other 300 or so molecules are pro-inflammatory. So that's number one. Number two is the brain doesn't get allergic reactions. In fact, immunoglobulin E doesn't get into the brain because the brain is protected by what we call the blood-brain barrier, which is not really a wall, but it's two sets of cells making it very difficult for anything from the lumen of the blood vessel to get into the brain.
Does that sort of it's like a filter? Sort of?
It's like a filter, if you wish. It's the same kind of filter that we have in the gut. So we call that the gut blood-brain barrier and then the blood-brain barrier.
Uh-huh.
What is amazing is in both the gut and the brain, the mast cells literally hug the blood-brain barrier. And if they get activated, either by allergens or by any other trigger, and there are about 50 different triggers that can trigger the mast cell, it disrupts the blood-brain barrier and allows the molecules to get into the brain. And that's where the problem is. Wherever that will occur, the defenders of the brain, called the microglia, see it and try to contain that process. So they attack the invader, so to speak. And in that process, they release their own inflammatory molecules and they self-destroy whatever is in that area. What is critical, and we've published this a number of times, is that one of the molecules released from the mast cells, abbreviated MMP9 or matrix metalloproteinase 9, breaks down the scaffolding that is used by the neurons to make connections. So literally, the area where this process occurs becomes shorted. It's like the spark plugs just don't work anymore. And so that's what we would call inflammation in that part of the brain. We use the word neuroinflammation when the inflammation involves neuronal cells.
Yes.
So let me go.
Yeah. So, okay. So we have a couple of questions. One was how do the allergies relate to autism and inflammation, and what is the relationship to genetics?
Sure. So when we first reported that children or mothers of children that were on the spectrum had allergic-like problems, that was back about, 60 years ago or so, it sounded incredulous. Since then, there have been numerous epidemiological studies, one of which was just published again, showing that the only comorbidity with autism is literally eczema, and then the second would be asthma. And both eczema and asthma depend 100% on the activation of these cells, the mast cells. So that's number one. That's the relationship. That doesn't mean to say one leads to the other, of course, but there's a very strong relationship. Knowing that, as I said earlier, we look to see where do the mast cells reside and why they may be involved. And what is amazing is that in addition to their hugging the blood-brain barrier and their potential to disrupt it and open it up to molecules that shouldn't get into the brain, the next rich area of the brain in mast cells is the hypothalamus and the amygdala. And hypothalamus regulates literally homeostasis, the way we function, our hormones, etc. And amygdala regulates behavior. And there, the mast cells don't get activated by allergen and immunoglobulin E, because as I said, it doesn't get in. So they're activated by neuropeptides, by pathogens, by viruses, by stress hormones, by a whole bunch of different triggers. Now, in terms of genetics, on the one hand, as we all know, many colleagues push for the possibility that there's a genetic underpinning of autism. But that hasn't really panned out for most of the cases. As you well know, there are conditions such as tuberous sclerosis, Fragile X, Rett syndrome, Rett syndrome, where most of the individuals with this genetic condition do have symptoms consistent with autism. But the other genetic problems that have been uncovered, we could call them mutations, single mutations, etc., that don't necessarily lead to autism. And in a number of studies that have been done, identical twins had only about 40% chance of both having autism. If it were not identical twins, it was about 60% or so. So both other colleagues and I feel strongly that there's got to be a combination of some genes predisposing these individuals, and then they get hit by all kinds of other factors. It might be environmental, it might be pathogens, etc., and sort of keep the balance towards the development of autism, which I believe is temporary, or put it differently, it can be reversed in most cases.
So
I don't know. You go ahead.
Are you referring to the symptoms or the actual cause?
No, I refer to the cause, because studies that looked at the inflammation in the brain, they looked basically at activation of the microglia, because it is the microglia that, as I said, are defendants of the brain. And then they've shown, no doubt about it, that there is actually activation of the microglia in the areas that I mentioned earlier. So now we have the mast cells, we have the microglia that talk to each other, and we've got this short-circuiting of the system in that area of the brain, the amygdala. So the three things that I always consider in cases like this is, number one, let's keep the brain cells as healthy as they can be, given that they're bombarded with this inflammatory process. And that's where folinic acid is very important, and we can talk about it later. Remove the inflammation to the extent possible, which I consider basically the rust of the spark plugs. And that's where natural molecules such as the luteolin found in the alginol product, Neuroprotect, etc., come into play. And then anytime you have oxidation or oxidative stress, you've got to get somehow rid of it, because inflammation comes hand in hand with oxidative stress. And that's where we give molecules such as glutathione or herbal molecules that have antioxidant activity.
Okay. So somebody asked, just for clarification,
Sure.
What are we saying is reversible? Are we saying autism itself is reversible, or if an autistic person or anybody has these underlying conditions themselves are reversible?
Well, that's a very good point. So to the extent that I might identify any comorbidity, clearly I will go after the comorbidity, to the extent that the comorbidity is more manageable than something as complex as autism. And in fact, many times, addressing the comorbidity will actually reduce the symptomatology of autism. So that's one thing.
Okay.
I always tell parents and colleagues, we can't put all eggs in one basket, because I don't know what we're really dealing with here. I've seen children in straight jackets, literally, because they were scratching themselves to death because they had eczema. Well, anybody who has eczema is going to be miserable. Their behavior is going to be all over the place. I've seen children that was, screeching their heads off, and they turn out to be extremely constipated. And when we help them actually move their bowels with, many different ways, that actually reduce the symptomatology to a large extent. But we're still left with something that has happened in the brain. So when I say reversible, I believe that both by addressing the comorbidities early on, as well as addressing the inflammation of the brain in ways that are very quickly mentioned, we can go into it later, we can actually reset the process in that part of the brain, and therefore there wouldn't be any reason for the children to be either hyper or super sensitive, whatever you. And one of the, if you want to call it comorbidities, as literally fascinating is, about 80% of the children I had the honor, if you wish, to deal with, is that they're hyperactive. And hyperactivity is not part of the diagnosis of autism. So unless we understand and reduce and manage that hyperactivity, it will be very difficult to deal with the rest. And hyperactivity might be because there is comorbidity of attention deficit hyperactivity syndrome, or they might be hyperactive because they're food allergic or food sensitive. So therefore, food allergy and food sensitivity should be among the first issues to be addressed, whether they contribute to or they're just running parallel, but make behavior obviously much more difficult.
So, okay, so somebody else asked, can people, we'll just say kids, for example, because that's what we're kind of focused on right now. Can kids have allergies? Can they have like an allergic response to something internally without having external symptoms?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that's a very good point. So since I mentioned what we call true allergy, let me now mention what we mean if it is not a true allergy. In a true allergy,
Okay.
they will do skin testing to various antigens, and they'll see if someone responds, or they'll measure the specific immunoglobulin antibodies to those antigens by something called the RAS test in the blood, or both. But in, 60+% of the cases, those tests turn to be negative, yet the children respond the way one would have expected if they were allergic. That's when we turn to the food intolerance test. The food intolerance is due to immunoglobulin G subclass 4, so we call it IgG4. That activates the mast cells through a receptor entirely different than the receptor for the IgE. The tricky part with doing the food intolerance test, and this is why many of my colleagues, the allergists, do not want to use it, is twofold. Number one, we in general believe that the immune system really hasn't developed until about 2-3 years old. Therefore, they don't want to be doing the testing, whether it's IgE or IgG subclass 4, earlier on. As I will indicate in a second, that's not true anymore. The second reason is if you eat something every day, it turns out to be false positive. So if you eat an egg every day and you do a food intolerance test, it will tell you that you shouldn't be eating eggs. So I usually recommend about 3 days before the food intolerance test of as blunt a diet as it can be, and many children are very finicky about what they eat anyhow. But if they can eat some boiled chicken and rice, whether it's mushed or otherwise, I think that's safe. I've hardly ever seen food intolerance to rice or quinoa maybe, because quinoa doesn't include gluten. And I dare say about 15-20% of the children definitely have food sensitivity or true allergy to gluten and casein found in milk products. And I know many families will try not to have them eat those without doing the testing, or they can do the testing, of course. Now, there's another set now of triggers that have nothing to do with either IgG4 or IgE that trigger the mast cells directly. And this is why we now use the term mast cell activation disorders, that it's a bigger umbrella than either true allergy or sensitivity to foods. And in addition, because histamine is such an important part of what we're talking about, genetically, certain individuals do not have functional enzyme called diamine oxidase that breaks down histamine. And that we call histamine intolerance. So the histamine can be coming from the mast cells or be coming from the food, but that's not sensitivity. That's just lack of an enzyme. Luckily there are supplements that contain the diamine oxidase, and one can give them like about 15 minutes before a meal. So there are different ways to address the mast cell related or allergy related problems.
So when we spoke on the podcast, I had mentioned, because we were talking about this too, and it made me think of my youngest, Emmett, who, if you allergy test him for food allergies, he comes back without being allergic to anything.
Correct.
However, under periods of high stress, he becomes very sensitive to dairy products and has a very, very visceral reaction to them. But then when we go to the doctor, they're like, well, he's not allergic. Is this sort of what you're talking about?
This is actually what you said is even more than what I'm talking about. Because on the one hand, as I indicated, one is not truly allergic, but they might be food sensitive. And in case of your son, I presume he wasn't food sensitivity tested. But I dare say we were the first to publish numerous times that the first molecule released under stress, called CRH, which is an abbreviation for corticotropin-releasing hormone, that we always taught to students is released only in the brain and activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's released outside the brain, in the gut, in the skin, in the lungs. And we showed that CRH does two things. Number one, it stimulates the mast cells to release inflammatory molecules without histamine, and it resets the reactivity of the mast cells, so now they fire to anything. As in the case of your son, for instance, he's stressed, he might have been food sensitive, and all of a sudden he's very sensitive to everything. And we've seen that very much so under very stressful circumstances, both psychological and physiological. We've seen it after major trauma, after major car accidents, after, God forbid, death in the family, and over the last couple of years after COVID, for instance.
Okay, so there was a question that came that I'm not sure that it's related to this specifically, but it has to do with the folic acid. She asked something about the MTHFR mutations being protective against some forms of colon cancer. Have there been any long-term studies on bypassing the absorption restrictions of folinic acid? I'm not sure if that's a...
Well, I can talk about that, but not necessarily vis-a-vis cancer. So just for the audience, an important vitamin for the brain, for all of us, especially pregnant women, is folic acid. However, folic acid needs to bind to the surface of the brain cells, that we call them receptors, that get inside, and once inside, has to be active by the enzyme MTHFR to make the active form, which is folic acid, methylated, so methylfolate, if you wish. Okay? So there are two issues here. About 15% of children on the spectrum have antibodies that block the receptor. It's like you're trying to put the key in the lock. It just doesn't go in anymore. Therefore, they will not be able to get folic acid inside the cells. But this is an additional problem because the methylfolate, the active form, when we give it as a supplement, still has to bind to those receptors. So even though we say, aha, it's active folate, if you have the antibody, it's not going to go in. And there is a test called the FLAT test that actually measures the antibodies, folinic receptor antibody test. So that's one. Then about 40% of the children, as compared to about 20% of the general population, have mutations. We call them polymorphisms on the MTHFR gene, meaning that the gene is just not working very well. It cannot make active form of folic acid. For both of these circumstances, we give folinic acid, which is still a vitamin, it's a natural vitamin, but folinic acid has two advantages. Number one, doesn't need the receptors. It goes inside the cells through a pump. And number two, it doesn't need the enzyme to become an active form. So you basically get two birds, if you excuse the expression, with one stone. And therefore, it's very important for children that have actually mutations and or have the antibodies that block the receptors to be getting both folinic acid as well as the methylfolate. And Algonaut will be the only company that by September will have actually a solution with a dropper that will contain both folinic acid and methylfolate together.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might have heard, or the audience might have heard, some months back, it was all over TikTok, that leucovorin actually can cure autism. Well, first of all, leucovorin is folinic acid in a calcium form, so we call it calcium folinate. The only difference is that you can get calcium folinate up to 1 milligram as a supplement. And that's what will be contained in the Algonaut product as well. Anything more than that becomes a drug. And you can find it either generic, 5, 15 milligrams, or trade name leucovorin. So basically, leucovorin is the trade name for calcium folinate, which you can find as generic, but with prescription if it's more than 1 milligram per day. That has been shown by a number of publications by my good friend and colleague Dr. Richard Fry, it basically makes language blossom. It might not address other symptoms of autism, but the language barrier is actually sort of overcome to some extent. Now, I have to caution the audience there. Most of the studies have shown that it works at 50 milligrams per day. But if you give 50 milligrams per day, most children become hyperactive. So I'm always a proponent of starting at about 2 milligrams, slowly over a couple of weeks go to 5 milligrams, and then increase and see where one stands, rather than jumping into the highest high level.
Okay. So I was just trying to pull these other questions. Somebody asked about what your thoughts are on stem cell treatments for autism in general, I guess.
The stem cell treatments so far, at least from the good publications, seem to, quote unquote, help in animal models of autism. Only one study was published that seemed to be reasonable in humans, and that was mostly in those children on the spectrum that had gastrointestinal problems primarily. Now, one of the difficulties, as you might imagine, is, first of all, the source of the stem cells. Number two, how we deliver them. Because if we inject them in the blood, they will not cross the blood-brain barrier to get into the brain. This is why in a couple of places, I think Cancun and maybe Panama, they can inject them what we call intracranially, but that's not allowed in the States. And even there, the results are dubious. I've had a number of families that went there, spent about $50,000, and came back empty-handed. So that field is a very promising field, but it's not a field that I would actually use right now because the evidence...
It's new and undeveloped.
Correct.
Okay.
And just to conclude on that, as I said earlier, it is mostly the connections that are broken, not the cells. In other words, the cells are not damaged. So if we give stem cells, the idea is it will go and replenish the damaged brain cells, but it's not the brain cells, it's the connections that are broken. And I doubt that the stem cells will actually correct the connections. But
so it's sort of like having a bad power cord.
Correct.
Right? So like your TV still works fine, your power supply still works fine, but the cord connecting the two together is what's not working. And
the mice got there and chewed it up.
Yep. Or I had a cat that was always chewing up cables. But yeah, so you're talking about basically correcting the broken cable.
Correct.
And then that allows everything to function the way that it's supposed to.
Finding out what chewed up the cable and then correcting the cable. Because if the reason for the damage to the cable persists, it will happen again, obviously.
Sure. Yeah. So you can chase your tail on that, but if you can address the actual underlying issue, then that prevents the cable from being chewed up in the first place.
Correct.
Okay. So someone was thanking you for answering the folic acid question.
Okay.
I really appreciate that. So what are signs that my child may have neuroinflammation, and how would I know that that's what it is?
Almost by definition, in my mind, if a child has the symptoms that we identify as being on the spectrum, indicates to me that there's neuroinflammation. When we looked at the children and we published 2 papers on that, we kind of asked the question, if there's no inflammation anywhere in the body, no asthma, no eczema, no GI problems, whatever, and we measure inflammatory markers in the blood, will we find them? And in 50% of the children, they were high in the blood, which meant that in those particular children, the inflammation of the brain overflowed basically, and we can measure some of the markers in the blood. So that's one way of looking at it. The other, I always say, either, as you know, the spectrum is very broad, and there are children that have unfortunately very difficult, issues, and some that are quite functional. So, the more functional the child, probably the less likely that the damage, persisted. But I don't know that. I cannot quantify it, necessarily. So, depending on how much money a family can spend, it would be prudent to measure some molecules that reflect neuroinflammation. And these molecules are not very expensive, but I know the families spend, everybody had to help their children, so who am I to say? But for instance, two molecules that are definitely inflammatory would be interleukin-1 and interleukin-6. We abbreviate them IL-1, IL-6, so those two. And then if the brain connections had been broken down, we measure what is called neurofilament light, abbreviated uppercase N, small f, uppercase L, and we measure the enzyme that breaks down the connections that I mentioned, MMP9. All of these can be measured by laboratories like Quest and LabCorp. So these are not individual tests that I do in my laboratory. So anybody can do those tests. If those are high in the blood, then one has to be, quote unquote, a little more aggressive in the approach. I don't want to call them treatment or approach because I hate the word treatment since I don't know what I'm treating. But let's say addressing the inflammation.
Okay. And you're talking, like the treatment that you're talking about currently, like what you do, that's all of it. Someone was asking if it's available in the United States.
Sure.
Or in the United States.
It's available. As I said, the three prong. Number one, give folic acid, gradually increasing the dose to help the brain cells. Number two, give the neuroprotect that contains the molecule called flavonoids in a liposomal form mixed with olive oil to increase absorption, to remove the inflammation, to remove the rust. And number three, that we didn't get a chance to talk, but 40% of the children, regardless of sunshine, lack vitamin D3.
You can come in.
Vitamin D3 is actually an immune regulator. So I always recommend about 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 a day. So this is the starting point, basically.
Okay. So one of the questions, I think it's a really good one, is how do I talk to my child's doctor about well, and then what doctor should you talk to, like pediatrician or neurologist? How do you talk to them about neuroinflammation without sounding like they're chasing a new social media trend? You know what I mean?
You're absolutely right. It technically could be anybody. Mostly pediatricians obviously take care of the children at the beginning. Then, of course, you have mostly child psychiatrists, because pediatric neurologists many times don't deal with this kind of issue like autism, although some might. And then, of course, you have anybody else. It could be integrative medicine, it could be homeopathic, etc. I always tell parents, and to the extent that I might actually talk to them, I furnish what I'm about to say, give them two solid scientific publications and go to whomever physician they will go to with a publication and say, look, this talks about neuroinflammation and this might be a way to address it. Can you take a look at this? Can we discuss it? If they go empty-handed and they have not read anything, they might be either totally ignorant, as many cases they are, or they might be too embarrassed to even consider something and sound like they don't know what they're talking about. Sure. So, for instance, Dr. Fry and Dr. Patty Ray and myself will have in about 2 weeks a paper published in a very good journal called Gut-Brain Inflammation Due to Toxin-Activated Mast Cells and Microglia. So this covers pretty much what we're talking about, which of course has been published numerous times in the past. But a paper was just published also, which was kind of music to my ears, and it was all about mast cells and in autism spectrum disorder. It was published out of Holland. Okay? So while we were talking about these many years ago, now more and more colleagues, not necessarily related to me, in other words, working with me, are now picking up the banner, so to speak. And therefore, it's not that difficult to find good publications if one looks for neuroinflammation and mast cells. Or you can start by looking at my publications.
I was going to say, yeah.
One of the best was published in a journal called Biological Psychiatry. It's published by the group that publishes the journal Nature, for instance. And it was about allergic diseases and autism. And it covered a lot of what we're talking about. I would like to step back, if you allow me, for 1 second.
Sure.
When we were talking about food intolerance, and I said many of my colleagues, the allergists, do not want to do the testing because we expected that the children will not have their immune system developed. Well, a paper was published in the journal Nature 3 years ago, and then it was picked up by an editorial at the New England Journal of Medicine. And what they showed, beyond any doubt, and it shattered everything I knew, believe me, and I know a lot about mast cells, is that the mast cells in the growing fetus respond to anything that the mother basically is exposed to. So if the mother has allergies, the immunoglobulin E will cross the placenta and it will activate the mast cells. If it is a viral infection that the mother has, or if the mother is stressed, CRH will cross the placenta and stimulate the mast cells. And what is critically important here is that the blood-brain barrier does not develop until the beginning of the second trimester. So if the growing fetus is exposed to all of these, and God knows what else, excuse the expression, it could be chemicals, it could be anything else. Not only it will cross into the brain because there's no protective blood-brain barrier, and even though the blood-brain barrier might start developing after the second trimester, I already said earlier, when the mast cell is activated, it disrupts the blood-brain barrier anyhow. So you basically get a double whammy there. And that's why it's so important during pregnancy to try to avoid, to the extent possible, all the triggers or conditions that might actually contribute to what we're talking about, including very early in life. For instance, numerous papers have shown that if a mother has eczema, the chances of a child having eczema when they're born is much, much higher. Forget the autism part. And you know how many children we say they're colicky when they're born. And many times
I remember this.
Say, they'll outgrow it. Well, there might be colicky, number one, because they cannot tolerate the milk. And a number of children cannot tolerate their mother's milk as well. That's not surprising. Or there might be histamine being released through whatever the mother is eating. And that histamine will actually carry not only to the fetus, but to the baby through basically milk as well. So there are a number of reasons why. That's why I tell parents, if the child is colicky, you've got to address it. Let's do the testing early on. Forget what science has been telling us until now.
I'll cry it out thing, and and that I want to touch on that too, because my youngest, again, not to throw you under the bus, Emmett, if you're watching this later, but he was non-speaking until about 4 years of age. We talked about that before too, and he was very aggressive, colicky, screaming, yelling all the time. Couldn't figure out what was wrong. So we did like the allergy testing, all that kind of stuff. And what it turned out was that he had a rare fever disorder called isPAFappa.
Oh, really?
And I don't remember what the acronym is for that. It's idiopathic fever. And he was running fevers like every 10 days that would last for like a week or so. And he was actually developing sores like in the back of his throat that was causing him pain. Okay. And his joints would get hot to the touch.
Oh, really? Okay.
To the point where we thought like juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. But his like SED rates always, whenever they would test him, like his SED rates were always normal and all that stuff. But until this condition was actually identified, and then he went on, he had his tonsils and adenoids removed and stuff like that. And he's working with a really good allergist and internal, And basically the issue was that he was in pain. And we didn't know because he couldn't tell us, and there were no visible signs of anything.
Of course.
And even going to the pediatrician as many times as we did, they never found anything because it was very specific. And unless they were looking for that very specific thing, there was no way to know. Sure. And so like it makes me wonder like how many kids out there who are experiencing, or families who are experiencing something similar, it's not just because they're just, colicky. It's there may be something going on
Correct. Correct.
that could be dietary related, or it could be a rare genetic condition,
Well,
And
let me bring three points to what you said. You were very much on target. Number one, in the case of your child, this is reminiscent of a condition which may or might not be relevant at this point, but there's a set of conditions called cryopyrin diseases. They're characterized by what we call episodic fever. So like in your case. So it might show up every 2 days, every 4 days. And it's associated with some skin rashes, sort of here and there. It's not like a typical reaction to like a mosquito bite or something.
Sure.
And also joint pains. And that has been associated exclusively by elevation of interleukin-1. And that can be measured, of course, in the blood. And if interleukin-1 is high, there is a drug we can give that blocks interleukin-1. So that's one. The second is, another paper was published in the journal Science, where they showed that histamine release in the gut, whether it's from mast cells or from foods, sensitizes peripheral nerve endings, and it's experienced as abdominal pain. So nothing else, just pain due to that. So as you said, who knows if histamine being released through foods or through mast cells. The third point, which is much more prevalent now over the last few years, is what we call alpha-gal syndrome. Alpha, like the Greek letter alpha, and then GAL. So alpha-gal is part basically of a glycoprotein, a bigger molecule if you wish. And typically humans don't really get exposed to it very much, but it is very prevalent in other mammals, such as pork, cows, deer, etc. And many times, not always, many times, if someone is bitten by a tick, they might not get Lyme disease or Babesia or Borrelia or other such conditions, but the alpha-gal is carried basically to the human through the bite. Now the human becomes extremely sensitive to anything that has alpha-gal. So if they eat any meat other than fish or chicken, they will react. And what is horrible is that many drugs, including drugs, supplements, cosmetics, they all contain mammalian products, but they don't tell you that. So if in fact there is alpha-gal there, they will respond to it. That's why in the alginate products, even though some of the products are in soft gels or contain gelatin, alginate actually measures the presence of alpha-gal, and it is not there. Otherwise, we would not use it.
Okay. I have 3 more questions before we wrap this up. And then for everybody, a couple of real quick housekeeping things. I will be reposting this, so you guys will be able to watch the whole thing. I'm going to put together a video with the questions that were asked and try and correlate it to spots in the video to try and make it as easy for everybody to consume afterwards. We're also going to do a second live like this down the road. We're going to work on scheduling that. And which other question you guys had? So all this will be available to you guys after the fact. So you don't have to worry if you came in halfway or whatever.
I can do the next episode maybe later in the day when families are back from work, so it might be a little easier to participate.
Yep. Okay. So one question is, what tests should I ask for?
Okay. So I can send you the list and you can post it if you wish. But definitely immunoglobulin E. Definitely immunoglobulin IgG4.
Okay.
Definitely at least specific immunoglobulin E to things like alpha-gal, casein, gluten, dust mites, grass, and any other tree that might be close to you, whoever the family might be.
Sure.
If there is any possibility, and we might have a whole episode for this, of mold in the house, then we've got to test for mold. Mold is a horrible trigger of mast cells, a horrible trigger of microglia. It's been associated with autism. And unfortunately, many species of mold release volatile mycotoxins that cannot be measured. So even if you were to bring someone in the house to measure mold, they will miss them. The only way to measure it would be actually in urine. And even then you might actually miss it. But if you have any musty smell in the house or in the basement or whatever, where you've got any stains on the walls, you've got to worry. And there you've got to use some, air purifier and take some remediated action, etc. Then we go to the interleukin-1 that I mentioned, interleukin-6, the neurofilament light, the MMP9, and you can measure histamine, but histamine is broken down in the blood very quickly within 1 minute. So I hardly ever see high histamine in the blood, but if it is high, that indicates an autoimmune problem because histamine then is being released by antibodies that trigger the mast cells rather than blocking the mast cells. So that's kind of, Now, I always measure the vitamins. So B6, B12, folic acid, and D3. And if any of those are off, I will correct them. I always measure thyroid function test, especially TSH, because if the TSH is off, if a child is hyperthyroid, they're going to be all over the place, they're going to be losing appetite, etc. That's why it's so important to get to some basic functions that might be quote-unquote correctable before we get to the more difficult part. So that's kind of the beginning. Now, for any child that is likely to have a lot of behavioral problems, meaning, hurting themselves or not being able to stay still, forever, etc. Then I ask for some gene polymorphism studies for basically 4 genes. One is the diamine oxidase, because I need to know if they're breaking down histamine. The other 2, one is called MAO, monoamine oxidase, and the third is COMT, catecholamine orthomethyltransferase. The last 2 break down the neurotransmitters. So if a child is very hyper, I need to know if they're putting out too many of those, because then there are ways to address those. And eventually, just one of the enzymes that breaks down everything in the liver, there are many, and the family is called CYP, but I actually asked for CYP3A4 that breaks down most of the drugs. And that is because we categorize any individual into slow and fast metabolizers. So if I were to give eventually a drug, I need to know, will they be able to metabolize it or not? Because that's the only way to adjust the dose. So a small dose might be too much for someone or too little for someone else. And many companies do these analyses. Of course, you can send for analysis of all the genes. That tends to be expensive, or ask for just this specifically, which is much cheaper.
Okay. So the next question, where did they go? They went right here. Are there any, supplements and lifestyle changes that may actually reduce neuroinflammation? So we talked about alginat and what you guys have. And we'll have all of, I'll have links to everything to your website, and we'll work together to put together information so parents can just kind of find stuff in a contained place.
I would like to make a point before we finish about this.
Sure. Oh, yeah. So the last 2 questions that I have, one is, what are your thoughts on the new paper that came out about using traits to break autism down into 4 subtypes? Have you seen that?
I've seen it, but in all honesty, I'm not sure it helps us very much. As you remember, we used to talk about infantile autism and then developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, and
yes,
et cetera. And then we lump them all and we say, few symptoms, average symptoms, severe symptoms, et cetera. To the extent that breaking down into categories will help us identify potential triggers or sources or reasons, yes, that would be important. But this subcategorization, it has not done that. So I'm not quite sure how it will help, to be honest. Let's see. Clearly, as I said earlier, if a subcategory has GI problems, then we need to address the GI problems. And if someone has serious GI problems, then I ask for three things on the stool that are not typically asked for. One is total histamine, because if the histamine is elevated in the stool, it only comes from the stool, because anything else in the body, as we said, will be broken down within a minute. I ask for eosinophilic cationic protein, because that comes from eosinophils. They usually go together with mast cells, but they're triggers of mast cells. And I ask for a molecule called calprotectin that indicates inflammation of the gut. In addition, of course, to molecules that we measure to see if someone has leaky gut syndrome, which is gliadin and zonulin, for example.
The last question, where did it go? And I know we don't have to get into this either, but they're asking about vaccines. And so my understanding is that vaccine injury is very real, but it's very, very rare, right? And vaccines are safe, and all my kids are vaccinated. We get vaccinated for everything. But those kids that do end up having a response to the vaccine, is that sort of, when you're referring to these triggers that activate some of these underlying conditions, is that where that comes into play?
Sure. So first of all, let me say I agree with you that we need vaccines. Millions of children had died of, polio and diphtheria, what have you, and they don't anymore. However, I'll take issue with two things. Number one, if a child either was born to a parent with allergic or autoimmune problems, or the child himself or herself with such problems, we've got to be careful, because I usually give the analogy, we're driving a car, let's say at 100 miles an hour, and now we give 1, 2, 3 vaccines, especially together. We basically just hit the immune system over the head. We're pushing it to 200 miles an hour, and the car basically derails, gets off the road. So I would be very careful giving multiple vaccines together at the same time to children that have that history. Okay. So in those cases, if I can spread out the vaccines, I'll feel much better. And the second issue is, I don't understand why and who regulates why vaccines became triplet and now they're quadruple, and now we're talking about 7 vaccines. There's absolutely no reasoning the vaccines should be given together, because when we give them together, we drive the immune system absolutely crazy, basically.
And I think I was going to say, I think for a lot of parents, like if they can combine them into either one session or one shot, feels like it's less traumatic for the kids emotionally.
I know, but that's the worst way to address the issue. Okay. I mean, when I was growing up, we were getting one vaccine at a time. Okay?
Yeah.
Did that make a difference? I don't know. But I know that the immune system is bombarded. And the immune system will go crazy. And it's not only what we give to create the protective antibodies, it is the adjuvants we add. So as you know, there was a lot of discussion about mercury, that it was changed to aluminum. These are called adjuvants, and those are added to overstimulate the immune system. Both we and others have published individually, not addressing vaccines as such, because we were interested in heavy metals, that both mercury and aluminum stimulate both the mast cells and the microglia. We know that. Now, in a small dose, for an otherwise healthy child, it might be a drop in the bucket. But if a child already has eczema and other issues, and the immune system is roaring, and now we push it, well, things may happen.
It's sort of a straw that broke the camel's back.
That's exactly right. And in my experience, limited as it is, I must admit, I would say that 1 in 20 families absolutely swear that within a week, if not within a day or two after the triple, the MMR vaccine, the children went down the tube. So, now, it turns out when I spoke to the families, that the families did have, or the children did have other immune problems. So all we have to do is just be careful and spread them out. And if there is a reaction, whether it's a skin reaction or high fever, just address it very quickly, because high fever does open up the blood-brain barrier. So in addition to giving, whether it's ibuprofen or, Tylenol, acetaminophen, etc., make sure that we use actually cold, applications to the forehead, because that's what worries me most.
You know what? We sort of talked about this before, and I want to ask this again, and maybe we could talk afterwards at some point. When we were talking about my oldest Gavin and the childhood disintegrative disorder and how he regressed rapidly, wasn't related to vaccines or anything like that. We don't know what triggered it. But he used to experience something that I would call a fever effect when shortly after he regressed for probably several years, when he would run a fever, if he were sick, all of his symptoms would go away.
Right.
And then he would be the kid that we knew before the regression. And this went on for a couple of years until it just sort of stopped. And when you mentioned that the fever, high fever, opens up the blood-brain barrier, if he's not absorbing certain things because whatever, is there science behind this whole fever thing? Because I know it's documented, but I don't know.
What you said is actually, in a way, somewhat different than what I said earlier, but yet true. There is actually a company called N=1, because the now adult child of a particular individual would always get better when they had high fever. Now, fever, can mean a lot of different things, of course, and fever is to a large extent protective to the organism. And so I always say, regardless of the issues we're discussing, we should never bring the fever down if someone is sick to below what is normal. The body needs a little fever to get the immune system, going. But the fever the molecules released under fever are multiple. And I'll give you an example. We get release of what is called leukotrienes. We get release of molecules called prostaglandins, which are blocked by aspirin, for instance. But there's a release of molecules called lipoxins. And we don't know much about lipoxins. That's a whole talk, on itself. But lipoxins tend to be protective. Sometimes we call them now resolvins because they resolve a process. So if in a particular individual, the fever, for whatever reasons that we don't understand, shifts the production to resolvins, then that will be helpful. If it goes towards prostaglandins, then obviously will be different things happening. And I wouldn't be surprised if in certain individuals, one pathway goes one way, the other goes the other way. What I wanted to mention before we close is a set of questions that are all interrelated that come up very many times. Okay, so we spoke, let's say, about flavonoids, about luteolin, about the alginate products. How do I choose which one to use? How much should I use?
Oh, that's a good question. Someone did ask that, actually.
Of course. Yeah. So number one, I should say, whether it's the alginate products or anything else, about 40% of the children have another type of sensitivity called phenol sensitivity. Phenols are found in berries, strawberries, in chocolate. So I usually ask the parents, if the children become hyper, then they're phenol intolerant. We can look at it genetically, but that's the quick way to get to it. All the flavonoids, including luteolin, quercetin, pycnogenol, they're phenolic. And in fact, I had a whole bunch of cases from Serbia where they were advised to get a natural product that was considered to be polyphenolic, because we usually say polyphenolic is antioxidant, it's good. And they ended up having seizures. So in that particular set of individuals, we don't want something polyphenolic. So curcumin is polyphenolic, pycnogenol is polyphenolic. Luteolin is the least phenolic of all. So number one, make sure that at least the parents know. Now, if we worry, then I usually recommend that one starts with pure lute, because it only contains luteolin and nothing else. And if they do fine, they can go through a bottle of that, usually starting with 1 capsule a day, and then you can go up to 4 capsules a day, depending on the weight. If they do well, then they can actually move to the Neuroprotect. And the Neuroprotect is a little better in the sense that the luteolin will get into the brain. Quercetin will act basically in the rest of the body. There's eczema, allergies, and the rutin will act in the gut to the extent there is gut inflammation.
Okay.
And because I said many families cannot have the children swallow, the children cannot swallow, they had to open up.
Sure.
there is now Neuroprotect low phenol liquid in a dropper full. So basically, if you squeeze the dropper full content under the tongue, it becomes sublingual and it bypasses the stomach, and it's much easier to give it. And you can also put in a little bit of juice or milk or honey or something.
Okay.
And as I said, Algernon will be coming out with a combination of folinic acid and the active form of methylfolate by September, in which case it would be imperative for families to be using both the Neuroprotect low phenol liquid, if you wish, and the liquid combination of folinic acid and methylfolate.
Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and put together all of this into a single resource that will link you guys to the studies that he's done, his website, our Algonaut, and then this video with the questions that were asked. And I'm going to try and transcribe everything and put together a source that is shareable and provides you guys with all the information. And then, like I said, we're gonna shoot to do this a second time, so you can DM me any questions that you guys have. You can follow Algonaut on Instagram, where they share all of this stuff as well, and try and help you guys navigate some of this stuff, because it's a very confusing, scary time for parents when they're dealing with this stuff. And unless you know the questions to ask or specific tests, sometimes you just don't know, right? And sometimes the pediatrician isn't aware of some of these things. So
just ask that what I mentioned earlier, meaning the folinic acid, the Neuroprotect, the vitamin D3, they don't work overnight. So I usually say, give your child 1 to 3 months and watch to see which part of the behavior, if I can call it that, is improved. Not everything might be improved at the same time, but knowing what is not improved might help them, help us, help them basically move on to the next step. Language is the hardest to get to pop up, if you wish. So depending on how functioning the child is, we first see better eye contact, following more complex commands, being more attentive to whatever they're doing. Then after 3 to 6 months, you start seeing syllables. There might be single syllables, but they have meaning, like don't do something, and they really mean that. Then they start having 1 or 2 syllables with a verb. The verb might be at the beginning or the end, doesn't matter. And we start seeing a lot of repeating words, echolalia. That's okay. Don't worry about it. It's like the brain is trying to somehow put everything together. Many times they ask me, will they be able to carry a conversation? And I say yes, but they might not be able to talk politics or religion. There might be simple things, but there will be enough for someone to be functional. And at the end of the day, as we all know, even at the university level, we have students who just function one way and the students function another way. Not everybody has to be everything at the same time.
Well, that's a great point. And so this is not something that is. So one of the reasons that I really like you is that you are so smart and so accomplished and so credible. You guys look him up. It's astounding, to be honest with you. And I'm so excited that we can have this conversation with him. But this is not a quick fix, right? This isn't. There's a lot of things online that prey on parents who are desperate to help their kids. What you're doing is not one of those things. It is all backed by solid, sound, well-established science, by credible, well-respected people like yourself in this field. So this is meant to be a resource for parents to help them find a direction to go in that maybe they just didn't know about, because we don't talk about a lot of this stuff. Like commonly, it's just not.
There are many organizations that support, of course, autism in general, in different ways. So I just want to indicate that one of them is called MAPS, Medical Academy Pediatric Special Needs, and they have a conference in Arizona at the beginning of September. I'll be one of the keynote speakers there.
Oh, cool.
We'll have TACA, which is the Autism Community in Action. They have the annual conference in October, and I'll be one of the speakers there as well. And I'm saying this not only to indicate that I am participating, as actively as I can, but to also indicate that these organizations have now come around. They talk about inflammation all the time. Not just me, they have other colleagues talking about inflammation of the brain. So the more colleagues and the more talk there is, the more likely that we will move forward in that direction.
Yes, completely agree.
And we're waiting to hear if any funding will be coming, available for such studies, because many organizations, God bless them, whether it's Simon's Foundation in New York, recently a particular family donated $50 million in University of Pennsylvania for autism, but they focus on genetics. And genetics alone is not going to do the trick.
Correct.
So we really have to be investigating genetics with what we call epigenetics, something that happens to the genes and it wakes up the genes, that's what it does.
I was going to say, because we need to understand the genetics so that if you have a family who has a history of predisposition to whatever, you could genetically test for it, say, prior to vaccinating your kids or whatever, so that you could identify risk factors and then make an informed decision about risk versus reward for your specific kid in this specific situation, right? Because that, to me, that's a reasonable approach, and so I think the more that we talk about this, the more information we get out to parents, the more questions parents can ask, which then sort of pushes pediatricians and other, of your colleagues to start looking at this stuff or paying attention.
What you just mentioned is very important. I literally learn as much from the questions as I do in science. And many times, our experiments and our approach has changed. To give you an example, I didn't really think the vitamin D3 would make much of a dent. And yet, when a family was telling me that they actually started using it, that was about, 10 years ago, and I started reading on it, I got so excited that we published a whole volume on the effects of vitamin D3 on allergies in the immune system. So had it not been for a patient basically repeatedly telling me, I really think there's something there, we would not have paid attention. But
so you guys can make a difference by speaking up and advocating for your kids.
Absolutely, yes. I just wish, whether it's through government or whether it's private efforts, there should be, I was a professor of medicine up in Boston for 35 years at Tufts University. And of course, back then we used to watch the Celtics. Of course, we still do, but nevertheless.
Gotcha. I don't judge you for that. That's okay.
It was the dream team. We need a dream team for autism. So we need someone to say, look, here is, I don't know, whether it's $50 million or whatever, but you're going to pick, Dr. Theo, Dr. Bob, Dr. Kerry, Dr. whomever, and just make them work together and give them the ability to work together, because otherwise we struggle to come up with money. We struggle with ideas that might be fundable, but might not be the best ideas to be funded.
Have you ever connected with the Autism Science Foundation?
I've been in contact every now and then, but why do you mention that?
Well, because they had them on the podcast. I think it was them, had them on the podcast. But there is somebody out there, and I thought it was them, that does what you're talking about, where when parents have like a really rare case, it reminds me of did you ever watch House, like Dr. House?
Well, yeah.
Where it functioned like that, where they would put all these experts in one room, whether it's through telehealth or whatever, and they would all work on this case together. From different perspectives.
I haven't heard of that. There is an organization now that does not relate to autism, and they invite you, and they've invited me, and I was added to if there is a very difficult case, then I send it to you for your own 2 bits. And we do it for free. There's also a group that mostly deal with mast cell problems. So it's sort of mast cell experts. There are about 150 or so of us. And, every week, whoever has a difficult case, they'll share it, and, whoever can, answer it or provide something useful, they will. But not for autism, I haven't seen it. Now, Tata did mention that in October, they're going to have an experts panel in one of the days, which is, a step in the right direction. But, you can't solve a problem with just a panel of people around the table. Everybody will just, speak their minds.
Yes.
You have to bring them down and say, look, we'll give you X amount of money. Come up with the next, approach that no one has done so far, that might kind of open up our eyes, rather than just drumming the same drum over and over again.
Yeah, I'll find that episode, figure out who it is, and I'll
Sure.
share it with you, because it does that. What you're talking about is what they were doing, and they were able to do it because of telehealth, and then they involved like the child's primary care provider, like their pediatricians and stuff, so that they can establish a care plan and what tests to do and stuff like that. So
Right.
I'll connect you with that as soon as I can figure out who that was. I thought it was a science foundation, but maybe it wasn't. But anyways, I'm going to put all this stuff together. But because it got cut off, I didn't get a chance to. The video is saved, but it's not going to have any information on it. I'm going to pull everything off, put everything together, and then probably release it as a post on here and YouTube and Facebook so people can find it. And then we'll have all the links. I can coordinate with you guys to get all the information so that people can find you, where they can connect and ask questions and get help if they want to, and connect with Algonaut and do whatever.
Excellent.
So
Excellent.
I am so grateful for you, man. I really appreciate it. And I owe you some paperwork that I need to get to.
It's okay.
It's been
Everybody's
a-
busy, but
it's
whatever
been-
you
yeah,
can
it's
do,
been a-
I'll make sure I get back to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you.
God bless you, everybody.
You guys have a great day. We'll talk soon.
Bye. Sure.
Bye.